welcome to the M Word YouTube channel. We're doing a little bit of an introduction around mental health, the difficulties in and around not being able to go to school, struggling with mental health breakdowns, which of course nobody really wants to talk about. And I'm joined by a really lovely guest. You are going to love her without doubt. She's very vibrant, she's very passionate, she's extremely enthusiastic. And between us, we're going to pull apart some interesting information around a case study of ours. So let me introduce you to Anna. Anna, please do tell us about you.
Hi, I'm mum to two young adults, one of whom has significant additional needs, and it's that one of my young people really that brought me to Lavinia, and that we've been working on, and that we're going to try and unpick a little of how we've supported them and the work that's been going on around them today. But they're 21 now, and I suppose really our journey with mental health started knowingly around the age of 8. Up until that point, they'd been pretty typically developing, very hyperactive, identified as having additional needs, but under that kind of encompassing school support, school action, it used to be called back in those days, support, and they were supported very well. They'd had a few blips along the way, but nothing major. And then suddenly, age 8, they had a massive mental health breakdown just overnight, which took us absolutely by surprise as a family. There were, in hindsight, there were a few warning signs, but they were so minor. And that kind of became a pattern for the rest of our life, really. The suddenness of the mental health decline and the lack of any real warnings, not just for us as parents, and but also for my young person themselves, was just really, really difficult to live with and very scary for all of us involved. But that's
When
that's
you
kind of
when
where it
you
started.
when you say scary, obviously for a lot of parents and indeed professionals, let's not rule them out. Um, when you say it's scary, why do you think it was so scary? Did you not feel you had the support that you needed at the time?
I think I think it was scary for a lot of reasons. No, we definitely didn't have the support. I mean, she was at that point, age 8, we had no support, none at all. She had no diagnosis, no EHCP, although it was a statement back in those days. We were nothing, no early help. No, we would, you know, we had a school who were very supportive, and the wheels had to start grinding. I mean, we were looking back on it, we were lucky in that services were quicker back in those days. I mean, we haven't got the post-pandemic waiting list that we've got now, but it
Mm.
still took, I think it took 9 months to have an ADHD diagnosis first and start on some medication, and then 18 months from kind of that day, initial referrals, 18 months to have an autism diagnosis, and 18 months to have an EHCP in place. Um, but it was all too late. She was never going back to school from that point, from that initial tipping point of mental health breakdown. And we tried all the usual part-time timetable. The school were great, put in 15 hours TA support immediately, one-to-one. We tried everything, but she was just destroyed. The shame. She was destroyed by the shame,
Mm.
absolutely destroyed. And there was no going back for her, although she did battle and battle and battle. Um, so it culminated in then 2 years out of school, um, not being able to attend uh, because of her mental health. She couldn't leave home. She couldn't, I think it is unfortunately a scenario that other parents will recognize. Couldn't leave her bedroom often. And the local authority then put in place, after some rather firm persuasion, suitable alternative education, which they felt was 25 hours one-to-one tuition in the home. Great, result, but not a result, because it just she's academically able, um, and giving her 25 hours with a tutor one-on-one created even more a problem, because it created such a even bigger discrepancy between the academic and the social, emotional, and mental health. She still couldn't leave home. And in fact, for a long time, and it was such slow steps, I suppose that's the other pattern that I really remember that we still see now, is tiny steps. So when the tuition started, she couldn't leave her bedroom. The tutor, she'd know the tutor was downstairs, and it took tiny, tiny, tiny steps for her to be able to engage. And after probably 3 or 4 months, she was engaging for 25 hours a week, and built up an amazing relationship with her tutor, loved her tutor. But there had to be a parent or a responsible adult in the home at all times. It was, the whole experience was life-changing for us. And the fear in the support, even when we did, I suppose with fear, is because we felt so out of control.
Mm.
The situation just felt totally out of control. We felt we had no control in it. She felt she had no control in it. And that's what I got back from the professionals when they were on board. She was open to CAMS. She was open to CAMS from the age of 8 right through till 18. And then we've had significant um, periods of time open to adult mental health. But it was as if the professionals didn't know what to do either.
I
They
find that quite staggering and also quite interesting, which is a real combination of emotions. But why do you think they didn't know? Because we're talking about a lot of experienced people, aren't we? So why didn't they know?
I'm not certain, but um, for starters, it felt like this kind of hierarchies within support, box ticks, almost like a ladder that you have to go up. Because I do remember them saying things like, well, if we want to medicate for the ADHD, which we did, um, we have to try this work first. Given her combination of difficulties, it's unlikely to work, but this is what we have to try first. And that was the
Right.
pattern. And that was a Ritalin-based medication. And sure enough, it didn't work.
Yeah.
And then once it didn't work, we could try other things and find something else. But it was that sort of, I definitely got that sense. And it was the same with CBT. She needs some therapeutic input. We can only offer CBT. It's unlikely to work given her profile of difficulties, but nevertheless, that's what we have to do. And
Right.
and so she did. I think she was given 10 sessions of CBT. She did 2. And at 2, the clinician just said, there's no point, and we stopped. But there was nothing else on offer. It felt like, I almost describe it as a ladder. Unless you go through rung 1, you can't get to rung 2. And
Yeah.
sometimes you got to rung 1 and everything stopped. It was that or nothing. I think that was part of the clinicians' difficulties. The second was, we were a knowledgeable background. I come from an education background, a special needs education background. We were very knowledgeable. So I suppose a lot of the boxes that professionals will often tick had already been done. I'm
Mm.
thinking about, visual timetables, sensory bags, using now and then, or now and next, reducing demands. They were very aware that all those things were already going on, and so their sort of general toolbox that they would come back to parents with had already been put in place, and that then they felt they didn't really have much beyond that.
Right.
Um, and I think also right through, but even in those early days, I felt a big um, kind of not wanting to take responsibility, or hoping someone else is going to take the responsibility. So education very much, well, um, this isn't our problem. We can't get her into school. That's health's problem. Health need to sort her out. Health need to make her better so she can get into school. Then we can do the education bit. Health saying, no, this isn't really a health problem. This is education's provoked this. When they find the right education, then we'll be able to work on the mental health. And social, both of them saying, and social care need to play their part, and social care saying, no learning disability doesn't meet our criteria. And just this ping pong between services, and
Yeah.
nobody, certainly, I mean, I try my hardest to coordinate them, but they're slippery to coordinate as a parent. Um, and I tried my hardest, but I couldn't coordinate them. Nobody else was going to coordinate them, so we just bounced really. Um,
I'm also quite intrigued as well. I know with the ADHD, they were considering medication, but usually in mental health, they will try talking therapy first, then medication second, and obviously the combination. And I have long understood that CBT is perhaps effective for maybe at a push 25% of those who actually go through with CBT. But it's certainly not for right for everybody. And I have never really found it helpful for those who are neurodiverse.
mm,
Because CBT is very much about stopping yourself in the negative thinking to change it, to challenge it. Well, if you've got a PDA profile, that's going to be extremely problematic in that moment.
yeah,
You're either having a meltdown or a shutdown. Take it either way, you're losing capacity to be able to shift your thinking in that moment. So I'm kind of intrigued why they pushed for CBT, but then again, if you're emphasizing that that's all they've got to offer in their bag of goodies, but then that
yeah.
almost is becomes an ethical issue for me. If that's the only thing in your bag of goodies and you know it's not probably going to work, why would you then persist at pushing a young person into that as if they were a guinea pig experiment? I mean, is it that they hope that it will work, even though they're all kind of being a bit negative? We don't think this will work, but we've got to be seen as trying.
That's what it felt
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like. Um, yeah, and it was a long time ago, and I don't know, but that's what it felt like at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and they were quick to medicate actually, but it was crisis. I mean, it was
Yeah.
absolute crisis. I'd got everything with my young person, as I said before, becomes very extreme on on a tip. It goes from, certainly for externals, they they function better and better and better and better and better until they're functioning. People that don't know them particularly well are saying, it's amazing they're doing so well. It's so brilliant. And then it tips from that into really, really high risk mental health breakdown in a split
Mm.
second. And the only people that really notice that this function, this functioning isn't really functioning are those closest to her. I don't, her family really. So I think that's another thing that we found really difficult, in that it's very difficult to get pet professionals to take it seriously until it's too late. And when you
Right.
try and say to them, we need help right now, they look at us like we're mad. They'd be crazy. She's doing really well. She's this is all good. We need to back off, not back in.
Yeah.
And that's definitely been a pattern. But because when she did have this mental health breakdown at 8, it was very, very extreme, as in fighting physically to keep her alive. She didn't want to be alive. Not all of the time, but she had moments, most days, where she didn't want to be alive, and the drive to not be alive within her was massive. And she had plans. And the thing that they've always been really good at is articulating those plans to professionals. And I think I twigged pretty early that when parents are saying something to professionals, it is just that, parents saying something. But when young people are saying something to professionals, it it's much more difficult for them to ignore that. She was saying, yes, sometimes I want to die. I have a plan. This is my plan, and talking it through with them, and they couldn't ignore that. So, so we were offered medication very quickly before talking therapy,
Right.
um, um, because I think people felt they had to be seen to be doing something, not just sitting and waiting. Yeah,
Yes, and I think also from a mental health perspective, it's worth noting that with ADHD, some people who are not necessarily diagnosed are misdiagnosed with bipolar or manic depression. And certainly with ADHD, when somebody is so low and so suicidal, the two blend very quickly. And especially if you then bring in the PDA with the impulsivity, the risk increases higher and higher and higher, doesn't
mm,
it?
mm,
So, with medication, the hope is that within 24, 48 hours, and certainly within a few days, the medication is going to somehow dampen those thoughts down to a more manageable level, um, far quicker than perhaps therapeutic talking could ever do.
yeah.
And did that work?
The Ritalin-based medication didn't work. It was the Ritalin-based medication was a bit of an eye-opener, really, because this was before her ASD diagnosis. She went on to Ritalin, and um, she became uncannily calm all day and incredibly autistic, much more autistic than we'd ever known her. Really finding it difficult to pull herself away from anything, becoming totally obsessed, totally, and wanting to pull herself away from it even, but not being able to. And then it wasn't funny at the time, but it soon became hilarious in family folklore. When the Ritalin wore off in the evening, it was like every bit of impulsivity that had been quashed during the daytime came out. She was whirling round and round and round the house, spinning on the spot, whirling round and round and round for hours, talking constantly. She'd hardly really been pretty non-verbal all day, which is not like her. And it just all came out in the evening, and she wasn't sleeping. So she didn't stay on it for very long,
Yeah,
not very
interesting.
long at all.
Okay, so the other thing I think is quite interesting to note is quite often both professionals and parents confuse autistic burnout and mental health breakdown. And from your perspective, what did you see as being the major difference between an autistic burnout and a mental health breakdown? Because you've emphasized at 8, our young person really complete nosedive mental health breakdown. So, but for you, can you just articulate what you found was the major difference?
I think the major difference was probably on a number of levels. One is the depth of it mixed with the length of it.
Uh-huh.
You know, really, I mean, it took 4 years really to really come out of, and it wasn't. Um, she went down very quickly, and then the rise up was very slow, but at least 4 years. And also the other thing is that, and this is a pattern that I've noticed, um, every mental health breakdown, and there have been a few, the functioning never returns to anything to what it was beforehand. So each time there's a significant, it's felt permanent damage to functioning.
Yeah.
Um, and to me, that's different from autistic burnout, because autistic burnout is not as deep, not as long, and much more recoverable from.
Yes, it can be quite a fast turnaround.
Mm.
Um, but unfortunately, what I'm seeing and hearing quite often is this very, very big drive that people say, oh, it's just an autistic burnout. And I'm looking at the presentation and I'm hearing the presentation and I'm thinking, you're absolutely a mile off. This is a complete mental health breakdown. And my worry is through my training and my work over the last 3 decades, is that a mental health recovery takes a lot of energy and time, a lot of patience. And with autistic burnouts, it's nowhere near the same level of comparison. It's very markedly different. Okay, so going forward then, you felt like this journey was getting harder and harder. There was a recovery period. There was a good recovery period from what I can understand from you. So tell us a bit more then.
Well, there was a good recovery period. So they spent 2 years at home being educated, and it became more and more difficult to find a school placement because she was so damaged emotionally. The therapeutic provision that she needed within her AHCP was not provided in the schools that could offer the academic curriculum. There was all the schools that could meet the therapeutic need didn't provide an academic curriculum that was suitable to her. Those specialist schools that did provide the academic curriculum didn't have the level of therapeutic intervention. So eventually, also, rightly or wrongly, we can perhaps explore that a little bit. Professionals felt, particularly clinical psychologists felt that she needed to attend a school residentially in the week. And I agreed with that. She couldn't leave home every day. It was just setting her up to fail to expect her to leave home every day. She voiced that as well and said she couldn't do it. And she was, saw going residentially an answer to that, really. So it was always going to be a residential school placement from that point that they were looking for, weekly, preferably, as close to home as possible so that it could revert back to day placement as and when. And it was kind of also explained to me as a bit of a exposure therapy kind of theory on it, because over this time, from the age of 8, in fact, it wasn't even gradual, she and I developed a very what became unhealthy attachment, because she wanted to live but didn't trust herself to keep herself safe, and she felt I was the only person in the world who would be able to keep her safe. So she became terrified to go anywhere or do anything without me. So it was part of that sort of thought as well about helping her and I with that attachment. But at the school that they eventually found, the only one 2 years down the road, was 100 miles from home. So it was never going to become a day placement. And it was also a secondary school only. It was only registered to take pupils from year 7. So there was no starting till year 7. So she had a gradual transition there from that last term of her chronological year 6. And started an hour a week and built up very slowly over the course of the next 2 years to weekly residential, and then 2 weekly residential by the 3rd year. So she would come home every 2 weeks and in holiday times. And when you think that when we started in a position for the whole of the 1st year, she communicated with staff, but she wouldn't communicate any difficulties or any problems with staff at all. It all had to come through me. And she would be on the phone to me 20, 30 times a day. And although, I really fought to keep that boundary, I didn't solve her problems for her. I didn't get involved. It would be, I have to put the phone down to you. She'd phone me, sometimes small things, sometimes big things. I can remember one of them in the middle of the night. I banged my head against the wall so hard, my nose is bleeding everywhere. It was sometimes like that. And I would have to say to her, okay, I need to put the phone down because I need to phone school, tell a member of staff that you need them, and then they'll come to you. And she would then deal with the staff and the staff would deal with it. But it was just that initial thing had to come through me, like the responsibility for it, the decision making around it. had to come
Yeah.
via me. Gradually, over the course of 2 years, that did fade. And it wasn't until the start of year 3 that I actually started to even say to myself, I think this, she might be settling, I think this might work.
Yeah.
And that's where I sort of say the 4 years of mental health breakdown, because I think it's at that point I felt she was, finally coming over the hill of
Yes.
the breakdown.
Yes.
Um, that was year 9. Year 9 was very much that cusp year. Year 10 and 11, she absolutely flew, really flew. Um, and did well in GCSEs. Um, she just to go back to medication. She was, when we came off the Ritalin, she went on to atomoxetine.
Right.
So she was medicated throughout this time for ADHD using atomoxetine, very high doses, the highest doses they could possibly prescribe her for her age and weight as an 8-year-old. Um, but what we did from 11 onwards, we didn't increase that dose. So as she grew, the dose just sort of went down with her, although we didn't change the dose. And atomoxetine was very calming for her and very, very good. But she had, as a legacy of the mental health breakdown, she had recurrent cycles of depression. She really struggled with depression, even through, year 9, year 10, year 11. She was really, really struggling with depression.
Yeah.
And CAMS wanted to use some antidepressants, but felt that they couldn't use antidepressants whilst on atomoxetine.
Hmm.
So the decision was made to come off the atomoxetine and go on to the antidepressants, which through year 11, which seemed to work absolutely fine.
Right.
Um, so she was in a specialist school with great ADHD strategies in place and lots of flexibility. Took GCSEs and did really well. Um, and then um, started at with the same specialist residential school, started at the local sixth form college to do a couple of A levels whilst doing other qualifications still back at school, which was a normal pattern for the school, something our best friend had done, started the year before. Other friends were doing. It was a very tried and tested route.
Yeah.
And she started, and by it was like history repeating itself, really. Um, by the October half term, she was in crisis very suddenly, and that same pattern of functioning, over functioning, and then crash, absolute mental health crash. And the only the only kind of rational explanation we could kind of guess at was that it felt like a reaction, almost like a trauma response to being back in a mainstream environment. It somehow seemed to trigger the same trauma response as last time they were in a
Yeah.
mainstream environment, which was is it's hard. It's a hard because primary school, sixth form, they're very different. But it was back in that environment, timetables, bells, more structured lessons.
Busy.
Yeah, busy, sitting for an hour.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of demand avoidance, I guess the demands were identical. It was that demand back full on seemed to
Yes.
trigger a response. Yeah.
And so, again, back in my training, if a person has a mental health breakdown, let's call it number one, because it is, the next time you have a mental health breakdown, you're going to go down far swifter and the recovery is going to take far longer.
Yeah.
What
And
was your experience? Was it like
oh,
that?
yes. I mean, it's swift with her anyway. I don't know that the swiftness was any more swift. But it was much, 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 much worse for a number of reasons. One, because of her age. The risks at 8 compared to the risks at 16
For sure.
are very significantly different. Um, and we, the team around her, her school, her mental health professionals, nobody, I think it had been so long and she'd done so well since the age of 8, we didn't recognize it. So we
Until it's too late.
we left it to go on for far too long, far, far, far too long. And she became really, really, really unwell, depressed, unwell, really depressed,
Yeah.
tipping into psychotic episodes, um, to the point that people were actually genuinely worried. And Cam's had started to talk about working to do all they could to avoid hospital admission. That's the stage we were at.
Yeah.
And this, I remember through that phase, and I've heard this a few times before, people mentioning, hospital admission being not that far off, and then saying, um, but of course, that's something we want to avoid at all costs, because the chances are, if she goes into hospital with the diagnosis she's got now, she'll come out with an awful lot more. If she goes into hospital with the behaviours she's got now, she'll come out with an awful lot more. And as a parent, that's really scary.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it feels like, it doesn't just feel like, I mean, it feels like all the pressure is on you,
Yeah.
all the responsibility is on you. And it doesn't just feel like that. I mean, it was like that. That's, I think, at 8, I can remember that from 8, but ultimately as a parent, it is all on you at 8, but it's not by 16, and it can't be by 16, but it was. So for example, um, she was at a residential special school, but was just sent home, too risky for us to keep here. Our specialist staff, including clinical psychologists, educational psychologists, occupational therapists, can't keep her safe. So off you go. You have her 24 hours and do the job. Um, no support at all. Uh, Cam's, we had some periods of daily crisis support, but ultimately, even then, even if you've got someone coming in for half an hour a day, it's over to you the rest of the time. And all the risk assessments written down saying, mum will, mum will, mum will, mum will. The only protective factor is mum, and it's all onto you. And when you put that back to what I talked about with the attachment difficulties, the unhealthy attachment difficulties that
Yeah.
developed age 8, and then 16, you're in this situation where mum again is this time the only person keeping a young person alive. That's professionals are voicing that, risk assessments are voicing that, and that's what the young person themselves feels, that they're not safe. The only person that can keep them alive is mum. It's right back to square one. And I would say at 16, that's even more damaging than 8, because the peer group are pulling away. It's a massive time, isn't it, between year
Yeah.
11 and post 16 education, that young people are out there developing into young adults.
Yeah.
Um, and so she was back to being, I wouldn't even say an 8-year-old, a baby, in terms of being looked after constantly, and being able to take absolutely no responsibility for herself at all. Um, and that took a long, long, long time. It took us focusing on 3 things: eating, sleeping, and getting out in the fresh air for exercise every day. And that was our life. And that was my job for months on end, to ensure those 3 things happened every day. And slowly by slowly, as that got easier, she started to recover. Because, for us as a family, um, this is, massive implications again for work, independent, my life, the rest of the family,
Yeah.
huge. But she fought back. She fought back from that as well. Once she was able, she fought back from that, and bless her, decided when she went back to school, I think around Easter time. She went back to school, just visits, just popping in and out. She wasn't doing any education there, but she was then started for social time. She then started to go in most day, and before the end of term in July, she decided that she was going back to sixth form, to the sixth form, the mainstream sixth form, to start again. To which me and the other people around her, her team at school, were just like, what? Well, it didn't work too well last time. So what's going to be different this time? And the only thing that we managed to convince her that she would agree to do differently was, instead of going back to do 2 A levels at the sixth form and 1 at her school, she'd only go and do 1 at the sixth form and 2 at her school. So she started back, and this time it lasted 2 weeks, and we were right back to square one. So, which makes me really more strongly feel it's a trauma response. It's some sort of PTSD response to being in that mainstream setting, because it was so quick. It was too quick for it to be build up of anything else.
But I also think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, within education, we view mental health clearly very differently from mental health nurses. And if you're working in mental health, yes, without doubt, our young person has been triggered by the trauma, but actually, the expectation of recovery is a very short window. It doesn't make any sense. If you've had a mental health breakdown, we spoke about this a few minutes ago, didn't we? What's the difference between an autistic burnout and a mental health breakdown? It's huge. It's much deeper. It takes longer. And, although people think it's a very fast turnaround, like an autistic burnout, it's taken months for a person to deteriorate, for then it to become obvious. But when you've had one breakdown and you're at risk of another one, and then another one, that tells me as a clinician that actually there was not anywhere near the time recovery given that was needed, and hence a crash within a very short time frame of 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. And that fits, because when you think the first recovery took 4 years
4 years.
and the second recovery a year.
Yes. We've got a shortfall of 3 years and the rest.
Yeah. But on the positive, we all recognized it the second time, spotted it much quicker.
Yes.
And therefore the depths weren't anywhere near as bad. But it was still difficult. It was still difficult. And, I don't want to go into kind of big details of events, but, our experience of these significant mental health breakdown involves extremely high risk situations that require police, emergency services and accident and emergency. They are, and each, I think there's 2 scales to measure it by. There's the depth and the length of the breakdown, but also there's also the level of risk within the breakdown. And although that second or third breakdown, which might have been part of the same one, were recovery seemed to have been quicker, the level of risk within the breakdown was increasing each time. It wasn't diminishing or staying the same. The risk was getting her behavior was getting more risky in the moment. And that
but
was
still
scary.
professionals putting you in as
Hmm.
you're the fail safe.
Yeah. You know, written risk assessments. Yes.
What is that like? Because I know that there are parents out there who are on suicidal watch
Mm.
24/7 and turned away from A&E, turned away from having any sort of hospital admission
Mm.
support. Da, 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 da. What is that like?
It's utterly terrifying in the
Yeah,
moment. Um, but for me, in the moment, you just get on with it. You know, I'm a mum. I've had a newborn baby. I've had two newborn babies. You know, it's as terrifying as that is, and you just get on with it, don't you?
yeah,
For me, I'm not. You know, I'm sure it's different for everybody's experience is different, but for me, in the moment, is not the worst because she's very ill. Um, the worst for me is when she starts to improve slightly because that improvement in my experience can sometimes be a fake improvement, and it can be, you know, we've got a lot going on. We've got the demand avoidance, we've got the hyperactivity and the impulsivity, we've got the autism, and we've got the depression and the anxiety.
yeah,
um, and when she improves enough for the impulsivity to start to get a hold, and the hyperactivity, then that it can look like she's improving, but actually she's not. That's when she's
yeah,
at most risk, because that's when she can put into action some of the depressive thoughts. And that's the most scary for me, because you have to allow that freedom, because they're never going to recover unless you give the freedom. But equally, the freedom can be the thing that creates the danger, the real danger.
yeah,
Um, that's the most terrifying phase, the absolute
yeah,
most. And you just have to. I've just had to go with my gut. You know, if and I'm lucky that there are a couple of other people around us that know us well enough to be able to have gut reactions as well, and we go
yeah,
with that gut. You know, and if it feels, we have to think about how it feels. And if it feels safe, we'll run with it. If it won't, then we'll keep all the measures, the safety measures in place as much as we can. But the other bit that I find really, really terrifying is, um, people are really keen. People have been really keen to produce written risk assessments and discharge us, A&E, you know, CAMS to do written risk assessments, even adult mental health to do written risk assessments, all with mum will, mum will, mum will. But what they don't want to ever do is revisit those risk assessments ever.
mm,
So I've got a risk assessment in writing for her at her lowest, her most ill. As she starts to get better, it's totally down to me to decide which parts of the risk assessment I start to ignore, bend, change. No support. And nobody wants to support that at all. So I can end up with a risk assessment. One of the key examples is I've had a risk assessment that says mum will, because she now drives, mum will put the car keys away overnight so that she has no access to them whilst the until the family get up the next morning, and she asks for them. That's fine when someone's really, really, really ill. You can't do that to someone forever, but nobody will discuss at what point you start to allow more free access to the car keys. So it's just all down to you
yeah,
to decide that all on your own. And I'm not a mental health professional.
mm.
And
It,
there's nobody to share that responsibility with.
I
It's
was just
it's
going to
actually
say,
down to me.
it's about that sharing that
Mm,
responsibility, isn't it?
mm.
And kind of talking it through and going, okay, well, we're here to support each other because nobody wants that risk on their own. Nobody's
Yeah.
going to sign up and say, do you know what, I'm I'm absolutely fine with any type of risk.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
if you
it's
don't change the risk assessments, they can't get better because you
yes,
you know it's a catch-22, isn't it? Um,
yes,
but to me, that's the scariest. That is the scariest is yeah. And it is really, really, really scary. And it's something that you can't talk to many people about. I mean, I there's been hundreds of times where we might have got to the point where she's well enough for me to pop to the shops. And I pop to the shops. But when I get back, I don't want to go and that's in the car on the drive for ages because I don't know whether she's still there or whether she's safe or whether she's all right. And as long as until I go in the house, I don't know. I'm still in that state where, as far as I know, everything's all right. But as soon as I turn the key in the door, and certainly when I walk in the bedroom, that I have to be ready for whatever I might be confronted with. And that could be absolutely fine. It could be an empty bedroom. It could be someone that's hurt themselves in some way.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
have to kind of mentally and practically sometimes force myself to do that because it's just so much easier just to sit in the not knowing, just sit on the
yeah,
drive and be
yeah,
like, I just don't want to go in yet because I'm not ready for it. And the same feelings, getting up in the morning, when you wake up in the morning, um,
yes,
am I ready to know, can I cope with whatever it is when I find out? Am I ready for that? And
yeah,
sometimes I put that off.
yeah,
And then I have a cup of tea and I have a piece of toast and take a bit of time for myself. And then it's like, right, I'm ready now. Let's go and find out.
yeah. And we don't really hear that side of the story, do we, of a life story of when we're talking around risk. And I think it's also worth noting as well that, you've had a lot of professionals in health involved,
Hmm.
but it is so interesting because the only clinicians who are, one, trained to do the risk taking, and two, are actively interested in monitoring and observing and recording the risk. Believe it or not, there's only one trade, and that is mental health nurses.
Hmm.
You've
Hmm.
got clinical psychologists. They might do a risk assessment, but they're so risk averse. They will not provide any form of therapy if they think their client is too risky.
Hmm.
And yet, a mental health nurse is expected to go in there every single time and mentally, in their own mind, do a risk assessment and note it. Um, and I find it very intriguing. We know that autism is associated with anxiety because of the environment. But as the anxiety continues to build and then it becomes quite chronic, that we have low mood, we're really actively talking about mental health deterioration. And yet schools do not employ mental health nurses.
No.
We don't actively talk about mental health in a way that we should do. We do pay a lot of lip service within education about mental health. We even highlight Mental Health Awareness Day, but we're not actively talking about mental health and how we can support one another when we start to see very, very early signs of poor mental health breaking down, because most people don't know what it looks like. So we're not talking about it enough to be able to get in there and prevent it enough.
Mm.
And then when it becomes so extreme, we always think, right, well, we'll call an educational psychologist, and they are not going to be able to assess the
Okay.
risk. An OT will not assess the risk. A speech and language therapist will not assess the risk. Let's leave it there. We'll come back for our next episode for the first.